agenda. If you have printed material you want to give to the board members, you must provide them to me or any other officer present, and we will provide them to the board. We also ask that the members of the audience please be respectful of others by remaining quiet so everyone is able to hear the proceeding. Thank you.
The time is 4:30 p.m., and this meeting is hereby called to order. We have the presence of a quorum attending in person. Notice of this meeting has been posted online and at the Fort Bend SD Administration Building for at least 72 hours. The first item on the agenda is action item, but I will turn this over to Dr. Rayback. But we only have four. You want for us to vote, or you want to wait? Yeah. Okay. So can I have a motion, please?
Yes. I move the Board of Trustees accept the superintendent's recommendation and appoint Aaron Morgan as Director of Facilities. Executive Director of Facilities.
Thank you, Ms. Hannan. Can I have a second?
A second.
We have a motion by Ms. Hannan and a second by Mr. Garcia. We're going to vote by show of your hands. Please vote. Do we have a discussion? No. Okay. Please vote. We have. Okay. Motion passes 5-0. Thank you. So now next is public comment, but we have no speaker today. Do we have any? We don't have any. Okay. So let's move on to next. Dr. Wayback, I'll turn this to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, members of the board. We are happy to have this time to have a workshop to really dig into a lot of important information, knowing that the board has some tough decisions ahead. So this meeting, as the team has prepared, is prepared to divide it kind of three ways. The first part will be an overview of the survey that was done throughout the community to assess the likelihood or the lack of support that we would have for any possible VATRE. Matt Gamble will review that. He is with Basilis and Associates. Right after that, Brian Gwynn, our CFO, will give the board data, many of which you've asked, a few you've seen, just to put the information and the numbers in context. And the rest of the time will be up to the board for discussion and planning.
Thank you, Dr. Rayback. So before we start, I just want to clarify two things. One is on the agenda. We do have a closed session item, but it's got pulled, so we are not going to the closed session. So for the 2 hours meeting, like Dr. Wayback said, we just focus on the VATRE discussion. And the meeting is scheduled from 4:30 to 6:30. So I am going to call a hard stop at 6:30. But if any board member has more questions, you're welcome to stay after the meeting. And based on the staff availability, you can ask your questions. So thank you. And we can start with Mr. Gamble. Thank you.
Hi. Let me start my video real quick. Right. Let's see. Can everyone see the screen that I'm sharing? Fort Bend ISD voter survey. Can y'all see that? Is that up? I can't hear anything.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So we are looking at the responses of 350 respondents. We collected August 2nd through 6th. The margin of error to a sample of this size is 5.2%. That'd be the same margin of error had we interviewed 350 people in all of the Houston area, or 350 people in Texas or the United States. It's just with the sample size of 350, the margin of error is going to be just that 5%. We also did an oversample of staff where we called 100 staff households, and we'll show you the results of that as well throughout the presentation. Our first objective in the survey was to measure general attitudes that are relevant to a tax rate election, and this includes the district's image. Also includes views on teacher pay, awareness of recent tax cuts, awareness of the recent bond elections, just a couple of various attitudes that may be of interest before heading into a tax rate election. Our second objective of the survey was to assess initial levels of support for a VATRE of 2 cents and a VATRE of 5 cents. We were testing both the official ballot language as well as what we call a simplified ballot. So a couple of things to unpack here. First, keep in mind that any survey is a snapshot in time of opinion. And so the data that we collect here is really letting us know what voters think today. And we ask these initial ballots or at the beginning of the survey to really just get a sense for what they think without getting any other information. And that lets us know our starting point. The second thing to mention here is the difference in the ballot language. You'll see that the official language is a little confusing or maybe not as clear as it really could be. And so we have a more simplified ballot where we ask them how they would support these rate increases. And then our third objective was measure informed support. And this is after we provided them more information about the proposals and what different things the different ways it could be used to help the district, the different funding priorities and other information about that. And it really lets us know the potential maximum support of these proposals when voters are fully informed. So our first question is always whether or not they have a positive or negative impression of the school district. And we found that 72% of respondents have a positive impression of Fort Bend ISD, only 13% negative, and then 15% just weren't sure. A few things to point out. First of all, we've had really high percentages of total positive opinions among staff and parents. 92% positive with staff and 86% positive with parents is extremely high. The second thing to point out is that our firm was the one that conducted the survey for the bond, and we found really similar image back in January. That was 68% positive, 19% negative. So really, it's a little bit better than January, just right at that margin of error. But we'll take the 5 points less negative as a good sign. And then the last thing to point out is we looked back at a little over 50 school districts that we've surveyed in since 2020. And that average of the name ID that we see across the state, 70% positive and 17% negative. And the district is just under really both of those, 5 points under the negative, 2 points under the positive. And so you're really kind of in line with the average district. Perhaps 5 points less on the negative is, again, another good sign, or 4 points less rather on the negative is another good sign. So we initially or essentially see there's really not any kind of image problem with the district. In fact, it's quite good. So moving on to a more specific question in terms of fiscal management is whether or not they feel like the district has enough money or whether it needs more. And this is a great example of how not only the question wording matters, but also how framing the debate can matter, and also really just the average person's understanding of what goes into a school district's budget. So half the time we asked if they felt like the district had enough money or it needed more for daily operations. And then in version T, we also asked or included the words, does the district have enough money for teacher pay? And we saw a difference. When we didn't ask about teacher pay, we saw that just over half thought that the district had enough money for daily operations. The net of the has enough minus needs more is a minus 15. When we look at version T, where we asked if they felt like the district had enough money for daily operations and teacher pay, well, they're a little bit more likely here to think the district needs more money. So the average voter doesn't quite understand that a majority of your budget for daily operations is for teacher pay. And so when we average it together, we've got 48% think that you have enough, 42% think you need more. Really looking at this, they're pretty split on whether or not more money is needed. Now you kind of square that opinion with this one, which is, do they think teachers are underpaid or overpaid or paid appropriately? And 2/3 of respondents think that teachers are underpaid. 25% think that they're paid appropriately. We do have 2% who think that they're overpaid, and 7% aren't sure. In this question, you'll notice a ver X and ver Y, and that's simply half the respondents. We asked if they felt teachers throughout Texas were overpaid or underpaid, and the other half we asked if they felt like teachers in the district were overpaid or underpaid. There wasn't a huge difference. A little bit more likely to think that teachers throughout Texas are underpaid than is the case in the district, with a little bit higher percentages of paid appropriately and just not being sure. But really, no big difference. And the takeaway here is that more than 3 out of 5 respondents think that teachers in the district are underpaid. So moving on to awareness questions, the first thing we wanted to find out is if they heard about any recent property tax relief from the legislature. And 54% have heard about this, and 46% have not heard about it, taking in the counting the unsure or refuse as essentially not knowing about it. So really, you're kind of half of the likely voters don't know about this. And I should mention, we're looking at the people that we interviewed are likely voters. The demographics of these types of people are likely voters. I can guarantee you that overall awareness, when you factor in unlikely voters and those that are just registered, is going to be a whole lot less than this. These are types of people who are really plugged into local issues. So there's a lot of education opportunity out there, and you're going to see that reflected in the messaging as well when you see the change in attitudes about supporting a rate increase. And then we asked if they were aware of the recent bond, and if they're aware of the 2 different types of tax rates. So first, 58% of respondents know that the district just had a bond election in May, 42% don't. Again, these are likely voters that are participating in a lot of elections. So it does show that not everybody is going to be aware of that. The second thing we learned is that only 39% of respondents know there's 2 different tax rates, the INS and the MNO. So we see that the average person is not really understanding that there's 2 different rates. And this speaks to the need to keep the messaging fairly simple in a tax rate election, an invader election, and to try to put it into terms that the average person is going to understand. We asked these 2 questions because we were curious, well, how many people knew about the bond and how many people don't know about the 2 different tax rates? Because those people might be thinking, well, gosh, you just asked me for money, so why are you asking me for this? Well, only a quarter of respondents recall the bond election and don't understand the difference between these 2 rates. So it's a pretty small number. And the other thing we saw is the correlation of these different groups didn't really translate to more or less support of a tax rate election. So it wasn't really something to be very concerned about. So those are just some of the initial attitudes and perceptions kind of leading into a potential VATRE election. So let's look at where we are on this official initial ballot. And this is the legally required language that you'll have to use. I'm sure you're all aware of this. You had an election of this type not too long ago. But they are essentially asked to ratify an ad valorem tax rate of so many cents that will result in an increase in maintenance and operations revenue. And what we did in version X is test the data or the numbers that would apply for a 2-cent increase. And in version Y, we tested the numbers that you would need to plug in if you wanted to do a 5-cent VATR. So we're just kind of split sampling this to save the respondent having to basically hear the same thing twice. We have 44% would vote for this, 50% would vote against, and 6% are unsure. So a couple of things to unpack here. The first is how the overall support and opposition is extrapolating, because you can't vote unsure. So this is 6% either would skip it or they just wouldn't show up. So when you just look at the percentage of the people who have an opinion, you're at 46.8%. In lower turnout elections, like the odd year November election and in May elections, the intensity really matters, because if you don't feel very strongly about something, probably not going to go make the effort to go vote for it or against it. And so we look at that intensity. And among those with a strong attitude, it's 29.6% for. So it's a pretty big gap in strong support. And again, that's just one of the measures that we look at. It's not the only thing we look at. We like to average these two data points together, and we get an average of 38.2% in favor. And this kind of tells us that if the election were actually tomorrow and people didn't know anything about this and they just read the ballot language, and the turnout was consistent with what we've seen in past November constitutional elections, this is what we would expect to happen. We saw a little bit of a difference between version X and version Y, with a little bit more support for the 2-cent verbiage than the 5-cent verbiage. Keep in mind, we didn't use the words 2 cent or 5 cent. We're just testing the numbers that would apply for those particular rate increases. So we always followed that official ballot up with a more simplified approach. And we asked them in question 3, would they vote for or against increasing the property tax rate by 2 cents? Most people don't really know what this really means. They might think it is really, you're asking them for 2 more pennies of taxes. So we put that into terms they understand. So 2 cents equates to $20 per year on every $100,000 of taxable property value. And the point would be to increase funding for the district by another $25 million. We found 44% would vote for this, 55% would vote against. And then we asked everybody if they would support a 5-cent increase. And here we have 35% for and 63% against. One of the things that we see all the time in survey research is the order of questions when you test dollar amounts can really matter. When you start asking for more money, increasing dollar amounts, you can start to lose support. And it works the other way around too. If you start lowering your ask, you may start to get more support than you had if you hadn't asked anything else. So we rotated these questions, and this is really important to pick up on and kind of understand here. When we asked the 2 cent first, it tested 43 to 57. When we tested the 5 cent first, it tested 40 to 58. So almost identical to the 2 cent. What happened is when they heard 5 cents after 2 cents, it sounded like more and we lost support. And when they heard 2 cents after 5 cents, it sounded better and it tested better than 2 cents did when it came first. When we look at the average extrapolation of which amount was read first, it's essentially the same, 37.4 on the 2 cent and 36.6 on the 5 cents. What I'm showing now is a breakdown of different key voter segments and their support for the official ballot, looking at 3 different numbers: the total yes, the total no, and then the net intensity. And so anywhere you see a blue highlighted box, that's going to be a place where you've got more strong support than strong opposition. And again, that's one of the measures that we look at, is that advantage or disadvantage with intensity in lower turnout elections. The yellow is going to indicate it's really sort of at the margin of error, and the pink is going to indicate more strong opposition than strong support. Immediately you see that staff really are already for this at a very high margin without needing to hear anything about it. Parents are really kind of a break even with their intensity, with 55% support. You've got a majority of support among voters under 50. And there's some other subgroup data here, such as if they voted in one or more of the last constitutional amendment elections or have not. And by the way, those that haven't voted in one of the recent constitutional amendment elections, they have voted in several other elections. So they are still very likely voters. And you'll see that people will vote this November that maybe haven't voted in a prior constitutional amendment election. So we could see the data that way. And then also bipartisanship. For better or for worse, what we see across the state is that there is a expected correlation with partisanship and bond and rate elections. You see Republican primary voters will have less support than Democrat primary voters, and we call them non-primary or essentially nonpartisan voters, and this is based on their primary election history. And so this kind of shows you where we're starting with those groups. And then there's two other measures that we want to look at too. Obviously, the 2-cent simple approach and the 5-cent simple approach. And to me, the takeaway is that staff are very supportive. The parents are really kind of they're kind of right there with support, but the intensity could use some work. Non-parents, we're going to have to really talk to them and explain to them how this could be important to the school district. And then we've got issues with a number of other voter segments, regardless of their partisan primary history or their past election history. Got some work to do there. So moving on to the messages in our informed ballots. At this point in the survey, we said we're going to give you more information about a proposal to increase the tax rate by 2 cents. For each one, for each statement, please tell me if it makes you strongly favor, somewhat oppose, or strongly oppose the rate increase. And I'll read these in question order, but they were randomized, so they didn't always come in this order. The first one was talking about the tax rate. And we said that the legislature just passed the largest property tax cut in history. And tax rates in the district are expected to decrease by 18 cents next year. All this proposal does is add 2 cents back to the tax rate, resulting in a net tax cut of 16 cents instead. And here, 64% of respondents said hearing this, they would vote, they would favor the rate increase. The next statement we read was that due to recent legislative action, property tax bills are expected to decrease by $1,149 on the average home. Adding the 2 cents would offset this decrease by $66 per year. The average taxpayer would still see a net tax cut of over $1,000. And we found 57% favored the rate increase, hearing that the proposal takes a full advantage of opportunities school districts have to maximize state funding through what are known as golden pennies, whereby the state is required to kick in more money, more funding to a particular school district when its voters approve a higher local tax rate. What's interesting here is in version Y, we threw in the term golden pennies. We're talking essentially about the aspect of a golden penny, but in version Y, we actually mentioned the term, and it actually didn't test as well when we put that in there. It wasn't negative, but it did better when we didn't use that language. And this is another place to illustrate how you got to keep the messaging simple. Keep in mind, a majority don't even know you have 2 different buckets of money. So keeping the messaging simple is always important in these types of elections. The next statement, we said 57 cents of every dollar generated from this proposal would come from the state. While the district would collect another $11 million from local taxpayers, the state would be required to provide $14 million. Here we found saying less was better. Just the 50 cents of every dollar generated would come from the state. Of course, this is just really applicable to that 2 cent measure. In question 14, we said all the additional funding generated by the 2 cent increase would stay in the district and wouldn't be subject to recapture. Then we talked to them about your relatively low tax rate, how you have the 5th lowest out of 23 districts in the region. If this was passed, it's anticipated to still be the 5th lowest. Question 16, we said that while some peer districts have recently adopted budget deficits to pay for increases in teacher pay, the district has passed a balanced budget and has done so using a lower tax rate than most. But this 2 cents increase is now needed to keep teacher salaries competitive with peers and do so with a balanced budget. This one on this page tested best, 73%. Say hearing this makes them favor the proposal. In question 17, we said the district has cut almost $40 million from the budget over the last 2 years to address budget shortfalls. This proposal will provide needed funding to meet priorities, close budget gaps, and limit additional cuts to staff and educational programs. On this page, we have the second half of the messages that pertain to the 2 cent rate increase. You see another 73% here. That one was talking about the district competes with neighboring districts for teachers. Starting salaries in Fort Bend are $3,000 lower than other districts in the area. This would allow for more competitive salaries to recruit and retain high-quality teachers. Above that, you have these two statements. 63% said they would support the rate increase, knowing that if it doesn't pass, the district would not be able to give teacher raises without adopting a budget deficit of $25 million. Further increasing the deficit for future years, this measure would provide the district additional revenue to provide competitive raises with the balanced budget. So some of this might all kind of sound a little bit similar to other questions, but we're testing nuances and wording and really trying to get an understanding of which approaches to the conversation are best. In question 19, we said that without a 2-cent rate increase, the district can't afford to increase teacher pay without making cuts in other places. This would protect funding for things like transportation, extracurricular programs, academic programs of choice. In question 21, we told them that the region's experiencing a teacher shortage, and Fort Bend is no exception. The district has been struggling to fill classroom positions. Last year, 200 teachers and campus positions went unfilled. This would help fill those vacant teacher positions. 68% favored the rate increase when they heard that student-teacher classroom ratios and class sizes are impacted by teacher availability. And this proposal would allow the district to attract more teachers to help improve student achievement and discipline in schools and maintain current class sizes. This is an example of how it's always good. We've learned in our research that, when you can tie things to students in the classroom, obviously, the teachers are in the classroom, but to bring the conversation around to the students and the achievement and why that's important, we find that is oftentimes a really good message. We found that in question 23, 66% would support the proposal, knowing or hearing that the proposal allowed for an increase in salaries. Central office staff, we said they perform critical functions like managing special education, payroll, accounting, technology, curriculum development. And then second to last year, 69% would favor it, hearing that the district is the county's largest employer, and the 2-cent proposal would increase salaries of 13,000 employees in the area. And then lastly, on the sheet, again, not always lastly because they were randomized, but we said that this would undo some property tax relief just provided by the legislature. And this is sort of what we would expect to be a negative message, but we found that 54% would still support the proposal when they heard this one statement here. So there is some willingness, obviously, to have that undone in light of these other uses of the funding. So that was a lot of information. There are a lot of good things to say about this proposal and explain about the tax rate. And so we found that we started at 44 to 55, and we ended 61% supportive and 36% opposed to a rate increase of 2 cents. A lot of movement here. Particularly, we lost 7 points when we went from that official language that I don't think does a very good job of, it doesn't say anything about increasing it by 2 cents. But then when we explain, okay, well, what we just read you was the 2 cent increase, we lost 7 points. But then when we talked to them about everything that the 2 cents would be used for, we had a net switching of plus 17. The other thing that we see is the intensity now is really in a good spot, 44 to 28. And you may remember at the beginning, I said the inform shows you the kind of the maximum potential. So keep in mind that not only is this a snapshot in time, but we sort of have a captive audience with the respondents. They're hearing everything we tell them, and then they're immediately registering their informed support. They don't have an opportunity to forget or hear other things that may be negative. And so it's really kind of shows you when they're really informed and they've really heard the proposal and the benefits of that. This is kind of where that is, and shows you kind of where you could expect to be after a really well run communications effort. The average extrapolation here is 62% for. So now at this point in the survey, we came to the 5-cent proposal. And it always followed the 2-cent proposal because we were sort of building a story. And we really started this section out by saying the 5-cent proposal includes everything we just discussed, plus 3 cents for other areas like campus police, special education, and academic choice programs. And so just to kind of keep it simple for the respondent, we tested the 2-cent and then just 5-cent. There are so many different scenarios of trying to do separate all the different pennies out. So this really kind of just lets you know that staff only 2-cent proposal versus going for kind of the bigger end of the 5 cents. And we were clear not to say, 1 penny was for one thing and 1 penny was for another, but just the 3 cents for these 3 areas. And 62% said they would support the 5-cent, knowing that the money would be allocated for these other things. In this next statement, we told them that some of the money basically would be subject to recapture. And we tested this 2 different ways. Another great example of how wording can really matter. In version X, we had more people opposed to the proposal when we told them that if it's implemented, the district would be subject to recapture, would be required to give the state $1.5 million out of the $39 million generated by the proposal. In version Y, it tested with more support when we said the 3 additional cents would be subject to recapture, which means that 9 pennies out of every dollar generated would go to the state and nearly 91% will stay in the district. So it's essentially saying the same thing, but just slightly different, and resulted in different responses. We then told them kind of the tax impact of this 5-cent. It would basically offset their tax cut by $165. But they still get a net tax cut of $948. We told them the next 2 statements were about safety and security. First was just pretty much a simple statement about how this would be used for that it would provide an additional police officer at each school to ensure competitive salaries with other local law enforcement agencies to hire and keep well-trained officers. And so this was about kind of adding officers to your, I guess, to your team or to your staff. The salary increases with the 2-cent kind of encapsulated increases for all your current employees, and this is talking about providing more officers. The next statement was kind of to maybe answer questions people might have if they've heard the legislature's provided money for safety and security, or maybe they remember the bond and some safety security elements there. And we told them the recent bond provided funding for that, but none of the funds could be used for salaries. The legislature gave you some additional funding, but it didn't cover all of your needs, essentially. So this proposal will fund the items not covered by the state. 60% were supportive of that. Then we had a statement about special education, how the district's special ed pop has doubled over the last 6 years from 6 to 12%. And this would be used to timely identify students with special needs and provide appropriate support. And then lastly, how the 5-cent proposal would be used to enhance academic programming, such as gifted and talented and academies of choice, to ensure that we said that academic choices are competitive and differentiated from peers so that the district remains a destination district or a district of choice. So not as much detail here with the 5-cent proposal as all the different statements we had about the 2-cent proposal. But even still, we have a really good switching support from 34 to 57% support. We see a net of plus 22 in the switching from the beginning to the end of the survey. And we also see an advantage with the intensity, 32 to 29. It's a slim advantage, but it's still something that it's nice to see that you can get the intensity above on the yes side above the no side at the end of the survey. So when we extrapolate this, we get 55.3%. Looking at the two different proposals and some informed ballot data, we see with the 2-cent proposal, a lot of support with nearly every voter segment. For even 50 to 64-year-olds, which are historically just the toughest type of voter for bonds and rate increases, because their taxes aren't yet frozen, they likely don't have kids in the school. They're just the toughest. They're even supportive with a net of +10 on the intensity. We see that the Republican primary voters, 41% are supportive, 55% are against. And so there's a net deficit in intensity of -15. So as a whole, as a voting bloc, they're more against than supportive, but wouldn't it be right to say that Republican primary voters don't support this? 41% of them do. It's just a majority of them are not supportive. And you see a larger majority of non-primary and Democrat voters are supportive at the end of the survey. And again, this is just kind of standard what we see really in every district in the state. When we look at those that have voted in one or more constitutional amendment elections, we see it's 54 to 43 with a net of a +4. This tells me that the turnout operation is going to be really important to go out and identify supportive types of voters, particularly your parents and your staff, because this +4 advantage with the most very, very most likely voters is pretty close. So we would like this thing to pass by more than a 4-point margin. When we look at the 5-cent proposal, you're going to see less support, obviously. And that's going to be a function of it always following the 2-cent proposal. And we just had to do it that way because we needed to build that story and tell them that, the 5-cent included everything in the 2-cent proposal. But you still have a majority of support with a number of key subgroups and good, intense, strong support with most of them as well. You start to see really the sensitivity here with these older voters, with the non-parents. Their intensity is a -3. Going back to it, I wanted to point this out. So we had 62% support on the 2-cent and 57% on the 5. So there's not a big difference in the total. What we see is that the intensity fell from, it was like 42% to 32%. And so they're just not as enthused about the 5-cent as they are the 2, but the total support is still pretty similar. So this last slide is really a great summary of everything we've learned. And I'll walk us through that. But first row, let me switch to a highlighter here. On this first row, this is a question to the official ballot language, where we saw that extrapolated to 38.2%. And that's the one where we just asked it one way, but we had half the respondents got the language that would apply for the 2-cent proposal, and that extrapolated to 40.7. And when we looked at the people who got the 5-cent data, what that rate would be and how much money that would generate, we saw 36.1%. So pretty similar. The simplified ballot, everybody got one for 2 cents and everybody got one for 5 cents. And we saw that was 40.9 on the 2-cent and a 31.4 for 5 cents. But remember, the order of those questions really kind of matter. The 2 pennies did better when it followed the higher amount. The higher amount did better when it came first. And so when we look at what came first, it's 37.4 and 36.6. So all of this data is telling me really 2 things. Work to do regardless. We're under 40%. And really, either one is going to be the 2 or the 5 is going to be just as challenging, and you're starting off in the same position. And then we look at the end of the survey and we see 62% for the 2 pennies and 55% for the 5 pennies. And we did see that 9.5 point differential in favor on the simplified ballot because of the order of the questions. And so, taking that into account, I think that if we had only tested 5 pennies, it probably would have ended up a little bit higher than the 55.3. It's just being sort of held down a little bit by always coming after the 2 pennies. So to conclude, the district has a great image. That ratio is a 5.6 to 1. 2/3 of respondents think that teachers are underpaid. But the issue is they're kind of split right now on whether or not they think that the district needs more money or if it has enough. We see that a majority of voters don't know about the 2 different tax rates. So remember, we want to just keep the messaging simple. We see those initial ballots revealing 3 things. I just went over these, but the 2 and 5 cents are testing similarly. We've got a lot of work to do with either of them. And the subgroup analysis shows that the communication work that we need is really across the board with every key voter segment, except for really the staff. They're kind of already there. And after voters learn more about the proposals, the majority would vote for them. It's 61% for the 2 cents and 57% for the 5 cents. And I'll just say, from my perspective and looking at the data, the key to success really isn't going to hinge on whether you do a 2 cent or a 5 cent, but really on the voter education and the turnout. And it's nowhere near my place to tell you what to do, do 2 or 5 or somewhere in the middle, but just seeing where things start and where they end. It's really about educating the voters and how these are going to be beneficial to the district. So that's everything that we learned, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Matt, for this very informative presentation. So I'm going to open this to questions because the officers we already had a chance to see the slides and asking questions on Saturday. So I'm going to first call on other board members. So yes.
Are we needing to admit Arana in? Why is she not in?
I'm not in charge of that.
Oh,
She is there. She is there listening. She can be admitted if that's what you.
I would like for her to be admitted because she had a lot of good information. Rana?
So, Ms. Garcia, do you have a question?
Yes, and this might be a question for the consultant. I don't know, as she's going to present something, I can probably wait, but I was just kind of curious about if this all has to be on one proposition. So is it 5 cent, one proposition up or down, or can it be 2 propositions, the 2 cent and then the 3 cent for the,
I think I can answer that. I think you've got to do one prop because the way the language is worded is you're approving an ad valorem tax rate of a certain amount. So that's the legally required language, going back to it here. So you essentially would have 2 different props approving 2 different rates. I don't think you could do that. That's my understanding. Rana, do you know?
Matt, this is Brian. I can confirm you are only allowed to do one proposition. It does not work like a bond. We confirm this with our tax attorneys, Purdue and Brandon. And basically, because of the way that the statute is written, it's an all or nothing. We can't tier it so that they approve 2 cents or 3 cents or 4 cents. It's all or nothing.
I was just curious. I think you know where I was going with that. So
That's
thank
a
you.
great question. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Ms. Hannan?
Actually, my first question is for Dr. Whitbeck. And are we going to have another opportunity to ask questions to staff about what we're seeing here? Or is tonight our focus on asking the consultants that are helping? Are we voting on this on Monday?
Yes, Monday is the last date. You
Okay,
have to
so the
set the
que-
tax rate, so that's
Okay,
why.
Okay, let me ask him questions. then
Now,
I'll
always,
go
staff
ahead.
can answer questions during the week, though, as you know, always.
Okay, yeah, you probably don't want me asking these questions out loud.
Also, Brian Gwynn has a presentation after this part, and he's going to go over a lot of what things cost and options and things like that
Okay.
might be helpful.
Okay. I just actually have some concerns about how some of the questions were asked specifically about extracurricular and programmatic things. So can you just clarify for me, Matt, because you said these are highly likely voters, when you were on slide 12? Is that correct? But the reason I'm asking is because we also had people who had no idea there was a bond.
Yeah.
And so, but these were, the people you pulled were highly likely because they voted in primaries, correct?
Well, kind of. You're kind of there. They're not highly likely because they voted in primaries, because we do have people that didn't vote in primaries. There are people who vote in constitutional amendment elections and May elections who don't vote in primaries. So that's a subgroup breakout, but it's not really kind of applicable to the point of the likely voter. There's a couple things at play. The demographics of the poll are really mirror to a constitutional amendment election scenario in terms of their age and their gender, race, ethnicity, partisanship. Those different demographics really mirror constitutional amendment election. And then the other piece of this is looking at the vote history of people that we did survey. We found that most all of them have voted in at least two general elections. A large majority of them have voted in all three of the last three general elections. About half of them have voted in a recent constitutional amendment election. So they're just more active than the average crop of voters out there that's registered that, doesn't really turn out to vote.
Okay.
So
Okay, so then this is just a question for staff, is if you can get to us pretty quickly, what is on the ballot in November? Because I don't think there's a lot on the ballot in November, is there? Are there lots of positions? Or maybe, okay, so she can answer those, because if we can't get people to the polls, like, that's exciting, how many staff are for this, but then my question is, how many staff vote? Like, do we have a lot of likely voters? Okay. Well, we didn't have a lot of people vote in May, so. Okay, I'm going to ask my questions offline. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hannan. Ms. Malone, do you have a question? Not at this.
I'm sorry, no, I don't have any questions at this point. I'm just listening, and I'd love to hear a recap from y'all's discussion on Saturday, and I'm just kind of digesting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Malone. Ms. Jones, do you have a question? Not right now. Not right now? Okay. So, Mr. Hamilton, do you have a question?
No, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. So I think for now, maybe we can move on to Mr. Guan. Do you want to start your presentation? Thank you.
Yes, and Madam President, members of the board, you do have the information for the presentation in front of you. It is paperclip, because as we go through this and get to the point where you all may want to consider scenarios, you may want to look back to specific information that's included. And as we work to get the presentation up on the screen, okay, so to recap some items with you as we've had our discussions this evening, the information is close at hand. So you heard from Matt that the likely voters could be receptive to a VATRE between 2 and 5 cents. And based on that information, you can see that we would generate anywhere between $25 million and $40 million, depending on the option that the board ultimately selects. If we were to move forward with a VATRE, with a 2-cent VATRE, both of those pennies are golden, so they're not subject to recapture. So 100% of that funding stays in the district. Anything over 2 cents, however, is subject to recapture. And so that recapture is about $500,000 per penny. If we were to go for the full 5 cents, it would be $1.5 million in recapture that we would pay. However, keep in mind the numbers that I showed you on the prior screen is the net amount the district will receive. So we will receive the full $40 million if we were to move forward with a 5-cent VATRE. This is our historic tax rate we've shared with you previously. We're about 11 cents lower than our neighbor Lamar and 16 and 17 cents lower than Katy and Cy-Fair. And both Cy-Fair and Katy have all of the optional golden pennies available to them. We do not. As far as our change in tax rate, this is showing you what our tax rate has looked like over about the last 8 years. And you can see we've gone from $1.34 down to the proposed rate for this upcoming year without a VATRE is 94.92 cents. And so we are lower than we've ever been. And so some of that is mandated state compression, but it is important to recognize that in addition to what the state has mandated, we have also lowered our tax rate locally. And so in 2017, we lowered our tax rate from 30 cents down, our INS rate down from 30 cents to 26 cents as part of a swap and drop. We increased the O&M rate by 2 cents, so there was a net drop of 2 cents in that year. And then also in 2022, we had an additional 2-cent drop in our tax rate down to 27 cents. And so locally, we have also reduced our tax rate in addition to the mandated state compression. The last two items that you can see on there is the impact of a tax rate increase if we were to do, do a VATRE with 97 cents at a 2-cent increase and just under $1 actually if we were to go with a full 5 cents. For the tax bill, we've shared this information with you previously. The average tax bill is expected to decrease by about $1,149 next year with no TRE. If we were to do the 2-cent VATRE, that would be about an $1,149 decrease, and it would be offset by that, basically offsetting that that decrease by about $54 for 2 cents and $135 for the full 5 cents. We'll review with you some of the compensation items or some of the areas of needs that we have. These are all what we would consider critical areas of need. The first one being teacher compensation, minimizing the impact that inflation has had on all employees, addressing the significant increases we've seen in special education costs, and then also to address safety and security mandates that we are currently facing from the state. And I think it's important to share with you all as we've gone through this. We shared with you previously what some of our peer districts have done. Our 3 most immediate peer districts, Katy, Lamar, and Cy-Fair, have all done teacher increases and staff increases of 3%. And so that was including both teachers and non-teaching positions. And this is where we are currently. We've shared this with you previously. We are at the bottom of the list among our peers at $59,500. And then we shared with you earlier that this spring, the impact of inflation on the district, and this has, of course, certainly impacted our employees as well. Overall, inflation has risen by about 14.4% since the basic allotment was last adjusted. And so not only does that impact the district, but very much so our employees as well. And so it's important to have that figure in your head as well as we look at what we could do compensation-wise. This information is new. We didn't share it with you all previously. This is sharing where we have vacancy factors, and you can see starting at the top, our teacher vacancy factor is currently about 4% of the overall total. However, for bus drivers, classroom aides, police officers, and speech pathologists, we're experiencing much higher rates of vacancy. And this is in part due to our starting pay and what other districts in the region have done, and so that is impacting our ability to fill those positions. And then finally, to wrap up on that final point, our special education costs. Currently, the district is spending in excess of $30 million to provide services to students in special education compared to what we're receiving in state revenue. And so that is something that all districts are experiencing, but this is the immediate impact it's having on Fort Bend ISD, and part of the reason that additional revenue would be beneficial to us, especially as it relates to teacher compensation. And so compensation scenarios, on August the 7th, we shared this scenario with you all. It had a $25 million cost, and I don't want to disappoint anyone before we get to the meat and potatoes of this. We don't have specific scenarios that we're going to walk through you on what we could do, but instead we're showing you what the cost is on this so that as we complete this discussion, you all can have a conversation on what you all would like to see, and then we can help you all walk through what those numbers are. So what we shared with you all previously had a $25 million cost. You all also asked about how the employees' categories were broken down in terms of percentages, and so we've got that information shared with you here where we've broken it down even a little more. We further delineated classroom aides, bus drivers, principals and assistant principals, and police officers. They were grouped into some of these other categories, and so you can better see what that looks like. But this is a breakdown percentage-wise of where those employees fall, as well as the actual employee counts within each of those groups. And so if you're looking at the graph, it reads clockwise, starting with that large section of 54%. That will be the teachers and aides, but it follows the text that you see on the right around in a clockwise fashion. And so you ask what options would be available, and again, we're not providing specific options here, but instead we're showing those costs. So in reference to what we presented last time, we shared an increase of $2,500 to teachers. That would bring them up to $62,000, has a cost of about $13.86 million. However, for each $500 increase to teachers, it's about $2.78 million. And so as an example, if we were to go up to $62,500, it would add $2.78 million to that $13.86 million cost and bring us to around $16 million. And then taking us to $64,000 actually jumps that up to about $25 million even. And so, again, as we go through the conversation this afternoon, we can work off of these numbers, and that's part of the reason we didn't staple the presentation together so you all can flip back for reference on that. Nurses, counselors are also included as part of this. The reason for that is statutorily, when the state has mandated raises, they've typically included counselors and nurses. They're not on the teaching scale, but we've included that here so that you all can see what a $500 increase for that group would be as well. And then moving on to principals and assistant principals, for that group, that was a 3% increase. They were included in the administrative component. Each 1% increase for those employees is about $260,000, and you can see it broken down between principals, associates, and assistants. And then for police officers, this is one area where we have made an adjustment from what we presented last week. Since we did that presentation, both Katie and Lamar have decreased the number of days that their police officers work. You all may recall we did that back earlier this spring, changed our police officers from a 260 calendar to a 238. Well, it didn't take them long to catch on to what we did. They preserved the pay of the officers and reduced their days, and so we're in a similar position. And so because of that, Lamar does have one of the highest rates in the region, and that's the agency to whom we've lost the most officers. And so to match their pay, that's what we're modeling here, it goes up by about $5,750 for the starting officer pay, and that equates to about $440,000. The cost of each $500 increase has an impact of about $38,000. And then moving to paraprofessionals and auxiliary, we shared previously the cost of each dollar increase for all of those staff members is about $569 million. And so we've broken that down into some of the areas where we have some specific hiring issues, specifically with classroom aides and bus drivers. And so if we needed to make adjustments to just a component of that, you can see what that impact would be as well. And then moving to administrative professionals, we've included some additional detail about who's included in some of these categories. The director and above category is all directors, executive directors, and chiefs, and the total cost for the 3% increase for that group is $280,000. And then for other administrative staff, this is LSSPs, speech pathologists, diagnosticians, assistant directors, coordinators, specialists, art facilitators, and any other exempt administrative staff. That total is $1.64 million and is about 693 employees. And so for this group, each 1% change has an impact of about $640,000 between those two categories. And then the final slide that we have on the compensation component is a breakdown of where each of those groups are slotted in the percent raises. Again, you'll notice that the police officers are highlighted, and that is because this is a change from what we shared with you all previously. But the total cost of the compensation adjustments, again, that we've shared with you all last time, is right at $25 million. And recall that a 2-cent VATRE generates $25 million, and so that was why we constrained it to that dollar amount. But again, this evening, we can go beyond that, constrain it within that, or what have you, based on some of the numbers that we have. As we go through this and wind down the presentation, we do want to discuss some other options the board may want to consider. From a strategic standpoint, differentiating our teacher step could be a way to have a dramatic impact on overall teacher compensation. I've mentioned, and you can see on our slides, that we currently have a differentiator at step 5. So teachers moving from year 4 to year 5 actually receive a $1,000 increase in step as opposed to a $500 increase. And so if we were to take each 5-year step as a milestone and increase it by $250 through step 25, it would have an ongoing increase in cost to the district of about $8.3 million, and we'll illustrate for you what that would actually look like. And so you can see here that bottom gray line is the current rate of pay that we have. And so if we were to increase teachers up to 62,000, and you can see starting at step 5, we have that differentiating factor coming in, going up each year through step 25. And when that happens, starting at step 10, really, or at year 10, we begin to lead the market, even though our starting rate is not leading the market, we're matching the market. And so that would provide a means of, as other districts increase our pay, some of those teachers that we want to retain, it would give us the ability to be competitive in that arena a little bit longer. And so again, that darker blue line at the bottom is our current scale, and with the differentiation we just discussed, at step 10, a teacher would make about $3,250 more than what they're currently making. At step 15, it would be $4,250 more. Step 20, $5,500 more. And then at step 30, it would actually be $7,000 more based on them continuing to receive their step increases. And so again, this is a means of differentiating teacher pay so that although we may not lead the market on starting pay, and again, this is subject to further board discussion, it's another alternative to look at. We'll compare that again if you were to go with a $64,000 increase to starting teacher pay. And so if you were to increase teacher starting pay by $64,000, which would mean that we are exceeding the market rate. So currently $62,500 is the highest any district is paying within the region, with the exception of Houston and what they're doing with their NES, but for a standard district, that would be considerably higher than those districts. The cost of doing a $64,000 increase for all teachers or all staff on P7 is $24.95 million. And so essentially it would utilize fully all the golden pennies that we have. However, doing the $62,000 plus that differentiated pay scale, it costs about $3.38 million less. And by year 15 and beyond, you can see that that differentiated scale actually starts to exceed what the teacher would make if we paid $64,000 with no change to the pay scale. And so again, this is just another way to look at the information. We feel like it may be a good idea for consideration, and so we wanted the board to have that as part of the discussion and not just look at our standard pay scale. There are other options that you would have that you could potentially consider. So as we wrap things up on the conversation and turn it over to you all for additional discussion, as a reminder, each additional $500 for teachers is about $2.77 million. And then a differentiation every 5 years for teachers, that's that $250 scenario we just talked about, has a cost of about $8.36 million. And then an additional $1 per hour for paras is about $5.68 million. And then we've discussed with you all those additional special ed costs last week during closed session have a cost of about $6 million if we were to move forward with any of those. And then finally, just for the sake of discussion as well, on safety and security, the important thing to remember is that as we're talking about compensation for officers, this is just compensating them more. It does not add additional officers to address the recent changes and mandates from the state in terms of having an armed person on every campus. And so if we were to go to armed security guards as opposed to having an armed officer, that has about a $2.5 million cost. And then having an armed officer at every school based on our new pay scale is about $4.6 million. And so these are items that as you all deliberate on what actions you all may want to think, we wanted to make sure you all had that information as well. And that concludes what I had to discuss. The only items that I would leave you with is that on August 21st is when we are holding a public hearing on the tax rate and when you all will officially vote on the tax rate. And so that's the point at which you'll make the decision as to whether or not you're doing no VATRE or any other variation that the board would like to consider at that meeting. If you do anything above 94.92 cents, that will trigger a VATRE. And so that would go to the voters for consideration in November. And again, we have initiated the required efficiency audit. Those results will be presented to the board in the October timeframe, so you all have time to deliberate on that before the voters finally go to the polls. And that is a wrap on what I had to present, and we're happy to answer any questions or anything else the board would like. No, and I'm sorry, we do have handouts, some additional information that you all asked for. Steve will bring that around. We have the tax bill. We showed you all the tax bill impact of a 2-cent and a 5-cent scenario. The information he's passing around now has from 2 cents, 3 cents, 4 cents, and 5 cents, so the variations thereof. And then also, you all had asked specifically about principal pay. We have the survey results of that and where we stand regionally that Beth is providing you all as well. So that is handout information that's coming to you now. I want to point out, I guess, one other thing. The presentation is no longer up, but on the scenarios that we shared with you all last time, the scenario did include a differentiated step 10 increase, and so you can see that's reflected there. So what we are presenting still includes that $1.6 million, although that could be backed out and replaced with something else. So I wanted to point out that we differentiated that in the presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Gwen. We're open for the questions. Ms. Hannan.
Yes, thank you very much. And the gentleman who presented the survey information, I sounded very ungrateful to him. So I appreciate the information he gave. So thank you for the principal information. And so the first thing very quickly I noticed is that Fort Bend principals are working 238, and Katy ISD and Houston ISD are also working. Ooh, Houston ISD works every day of the year, I guess. So, yes.
Ms. Hannan, I apologize. One thing I do want to interject, the information that you're looking at on the principal compensation is based on last year's information. It does not incorporate the increases that we just discussed that Katy, Lamar, and Cy-Fair have. This is based on a TASB study. So their increases are not reflected in what you're seeing now. So we didn't indicate that at the onset. I want to mention that.
Okay, but the increases for teachers is reflected?
Yes, ma'am, and that's because the information on the principal study is from a TASB study, whereas we did the survey on the teacher pay.
Okay. And I'm going to be very unpopular with administrators and principals and APs and such. This question isn't about LSSPs and people that are really that makes it sound like principals aren't working with students, and that's not what I mean. But I'm pondering how to dig myself out of the hole I've just put myself into. The bottom line is, well, let me just ask this. Do we have any challenges with filling our AP positions, our principal positions, our director, executive director? Like we have 200 last year unfilled teaching positions, and we, struggle get with LSSPs. And so I really want to know, do we struggle filling the administrative roles? And I know that is only, I think you said 3% of this. No, it was more than that, because it was 3% and 7%. So that's my question.
Yeah, Ms. Hannon, one thing that I've seen in the districts I've been in, when there's an ongoing differentiation between teacher increases and the pay increases for administration, you end up experiencing salary compression, okay? And the pay for assistant principals, especially elementary assistant principals, that's where you have a hard time filling those spots because of that. If the board decided to do the differentiated pay scenario, I think in particular that would be problematic in that regard. I mean, it would be good for a lot of other reasons, but it'd be problematic from a compression perspective, because you're talking about, for the 25-year teachers, a raise of $7,000, which is,
significantly
higher than what the APs would get, even with the
Right.
3,000.
And I understand that. Many years ago, when I moved from the classroom into this building, I lost money.
Yeah, so that compression.
It was not a bonus.
And that compression is, very significant when, the APs, they're exempt, they're, all the other hours that they do.
So you would anticipate that we would have
Yes.
problems filling those, but
And I've definitely seen that impact of compression at the other
okay,
districts
but
I've
at this
been
time, we don't.
I don't have those numbers in front of me.
Okay.
I can give you, though, currently, we have a vacancy at Cornerstone. No, Walker Station, Walker Station Elementary, when the principal was promoted to be principal at Thornton. And we have not, at this time, secured an applicant that is the right match for that community. So that's why we have an interim in there at this time. We also now have a vacancy at Malala because of Ms. Langston going to executive director. So again, they're in the process of that. So I would not say that we cannot find good quality people, because we have good quality people. But I do think that based on how many we used to have and how many we have today, I don't think we have as many applying as we used to. And that's due to a lot of things.
And that could be the
Lots
nature
things.
of
Yes.
everybody saying, I'm hanging it up.
And the extra contract days, nights that are required, things like that.
Okay. And is that something we've ever looked at, is reducing these duty pay days to be more in line with something like Cy-Fair and A-Leaf and Lamar? Clear Creek?
One thing that's a little bit, I think, misleading on those days, and having worked in it, I know, like, you can be a 238, but you give 10 days of vacation, whereas you can be a 228, and then that's not built in. So sometimes they'll actually close between July 1st and July 15th or something like this, so there's an automatic off. We have that, but we use days for it. So everybody does those things just a little different, so it's actually not an apples to apples on that one column of how many days you work.
Okay. And then I think before, and maybe Mr. Gwynn or someone can, because I appreciate these differentiated pay scales, because I do think, really supporting some sort of incentive for longevity in this district is good. So I'm really happy to see those two. But I just want to understand the difference between those two scenarios a little better. I think I got it, but I'll call you on that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hannon. I think those questions are really good questions. I appreciate that. Mr. Garcia, do you have a question?
On the the recapture, if we start dipping into the 3 cents and higher, is there any risk to the district that recapture amount, and I can't remember how it breaks up, that recapture amount goes up after, say, the first year or 2 or 3 years down the road? Because right now it's every cent, it's $500,000, correct?
The answer, you could have two things that could happen. It actually could go up or it could go down. The scenario in which it could go up would be we start to see enrollment declines or changes in property value. And then the opposite would occur is if we see student growth that exceeds what we're projecting or goes higher than the ADA increases.
Yeah, so average daily attendance impacts it, as does the basic allotment. If the basic allotment goes up high enough that we wouldn't have any recapture. So there's several variables part of it, but the property values is definitely one of them.
Thank you. I just wanted to get that out there.
Mr. Hamilton.
Yes, Mr. Viltz, since you're here and Mr. Jones is not here, please pass this along. The two of you are absolute wizards because we've been getting some communication about bus issues. My own family had a little bus issue today, but now that I see that 40% vacancy rate, it's incredible that we don't have 40,000 emails and phone calls. So y'all are doing a great job despite that vacancy rate, but that vacancy rate is very alarming. So question, do we think, so I fully support what we're doing with the officer pay, to not just try to do a good enough increase, but to try to jump to where we are, even with Lamar, so that we stop losing officers to Lamar. Would the proposed increase for bus drivers, do we think that would have the same impact to where we would stop losing bus drivers or be able to make a significant improvement on that vacancy rate for bus drivers?
Yes, sir. Thank you for asking that question. We definitely believe that the increase in pay would improve retention, not only retention, but also assist with recruitment. We are fighting against every other school district, municipality. Everyone's competing for a limited pool of bus drivers, so any increase would definitely help with recruitment and retention.
Can you remind them what the hourly rate is right now for our bus drivers? Is it 19 or is it 20? Oh, it's 20? Okay, okay, thank you.
So then one other comment on the teacher pay. I think I shared this story last year when we were discussing the Vader. So different industries. So this is oil and gas. So a certain refining company, an engineer there shared a story with me that they had, relative to the market, they had very low pay and very weak employee benefits. And so what they found was that they were basically the training company. So the only people they could hire were people fresh out of college. And those people would come work for that company for 4 or 5 years and then go get a job with a refining company that had better pay and better benefits. And so just that's something that's kind of stuck with me. And I think as we look to try to be as competitive as we can, I think it's good for us to try to be in a position where we are. I support the step approach to where we're more competitive for more experienced teachers, so that if anything, we're that district that is appealing to experienced and great teachers from other districts rather than being on the losing end of that trade-off. So I like that we have that differentiation rather than trying to be the steady increase all along. I like that, the step increase personally. So thank you for all that information.
I did want to just throw in, because I've talked to Mike Jones a little bit about transportation pay and whatever else. If the board members are potentially willing to go above 2 pennies, when it comes to transportation, I think having a $2 increase would go a long way toward reducing that vacancy rate. I think we'd be able to keep a lot and have less turnover by just doing the dollar. But in terms of recruiting and whatever else, I think that's what would make a difference. These guys have kept it together okay? But part of that is because all of these other folks are driving. I mean, the office staff, I mean, everybody's driving, and that's not something that you can really sustain long-term. And so I would just encourage the board when they're looking at various scenarios that if you're willing to go into the Copper Penny area, that you should consider that additional $600,000 for that other dollar for the bus drivers.
And just as to keep you abreast of what we're doing, so in doing that, if you go back to the sheet where we showed you the breakdown, you can see that basically for the bus drivers, if you were to go up an additional $1, the cost of a $1 increase is about $550,000. So going up to $2 an hour would have a cost of just over $1 million, about $1.1 million, as opposed to $550,000. And so that's part of the reason we structured things the way that we did. So as you all make those comments, we can provide you all the impact immediately. And then if you all settle on what you would like to see, we can provide you with an overall scenario of what that cost would be.
Thank you, Ms. Gwen. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Ms. Jones, do you have a question?
Thank you. So if we don't approve the VATRE, and let me backtrack there. I'm for raises, okay? 100% for raises. Are you saying that there will be no unfunded, are there going to be unfunded mandates for Fort Bend ISD, or?
So the budget that was adopted by the board did not include raises for staff for the school year that we are in.
Right.
The VATRE would allow us to implement raises for the current year. But on top of the need to do raises, yes, there are unfunded mandates that we had specifically around adding the armed personnel at all schools. And I say armed personnel, having an armed person at every school. And I think Chief has discussed with you all what some of the options are. And the recommendation from staff has tended to be, we want licensed peace officers, but there are some alternatives. So in short, we don't have a mandate for a raise from the state. That would only come if they increase the basic allotment. But as it relates to what we have raise-wise right now, the answer is, other than the retention supplement that the board approved, there are no raises in the current year for staff.
Okay. I guess, what are some of our other alternatives to, I know there are school marshals and school guardians that can also, if we do not have peace officers, have we looked into how much that would also cost? As well as, I'm for competitive for the police officers, but if we don't have them, we just don't have them. So what are our alternatives?
So I can answer some of that. So there is we went back and looked at House Bill 3. There is another solution. We talked about the guardians, we talked about the marshals, and we talked about the police officers. House Bill 3 also, if the board files a good cause exception to House Bill 3 saying that we don't have police officers and we don't have the funding, then the board can declare a good cause exception. And one alternative that we could meet House Bill 3 is with armed private security. So the law does allow for that now. We've reached out to some firms to get some type of idea of what that would cost, and that's what Mr. Gwynn had in his presentation, the $2.5 million. Okay. So that would get us in compliance with House Bill 3, just to be perfectly transparent, if we went with the armed private security, then we would not be responsible for buying cars, radios, uniforms, all the things that go along with an officer, not just the salary, but all the equipment and everything that goes along with them. You would have to multiply that by 50 as well. So it gets expensive, and we're well aware of that. But we also are kind of forced into this situation by the state. And so, in looking at all the alternatives, the other thing that the armed private security does is there's no overlapping job roles between a marshal who might be a teacher, and also we're expecting them to provide safety for the campus. There's no overlapping job roles there. And so the armed private security would be able to provide security and be a visible deterrent, and they would be in uniform. And so there's some advantages to that. So does that answer your question?
Yes, that answers my question. Okay. I'll reserve my other questions for later.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Ms. Malone.
Sure, I'd still appreciate an update from whatever you guys came up with on Saturday. That would be great. But also, I think we're all along, honestly, the same lines. Ms. Hannon, from the beginning, when you were referring to what's the demand, I think we've heard from other board members as well previously. We all shared the sentiments of concern that we want to place we want to make sure that we're filling the needs that we have. But honestly, Mr. Gwynn, the thing that I'm struggling with when I'm going through the presentation is on the vacancy rates of the 4%, 40%, 1, 13, et cetera. You go down the lines. And then I'm wondering is regarding workforce planning and maybe, actually she's not here right now. I was going to say maybe Glenda knew the answer to some of this, but I'm wondering what is the demand versus the supply at the varying wage levels. So I'm looking at the economics of it and wondering where the supply and demand curves are. Because the other thing is, as Ms. Jones just mentioned, and wanting to know essentially what's the availability of officers, right? Yeah, we've got the capacity and we have the demand for officers, but the truth is there's been a reduction in the force overall, and that less folks are entering the field. And that's the same holds true with teaching when you look at the amount of graduates that are entering the teaching field versus the amount that are retiring. It's a statewide issue, and it's also a national issue. And so as much as I'm wanting to consider, and that goes the same thing, honestly, when I go down the entire list here, so I'm not going to, for the sake of time and efficiency, I'm not going to continue going down that list, but I don't believe we're addressing the root, because the root is not just money, even though I also have, fine, if paying more people or paying an increase in compensation is the answer, show me. Show me that's the answer. So show me the supply and the demand curve on how I know that at a certain wage level, that is going to change our circumstances. Because I'm going to give an example, and that's the bus drivers. We already increased their pay to $20 an hour, and we still have an issue, and it looks like we have 40.2% vacancy. And we're not the lowest in bus driver pay when you look around, but we still have the issue. Why aren't they wanting to work for us? And so I'm going to be honest with you, because I myself was a bus driver, as I've told y'all before. I've asked some of them, and I want to know and understand what is the issue. Why aren't you driving the bus anymore? How come, whatever it might be. What is the reason behind it? And honestly, guys, money's not even the answer on most of these situations. Same thing with teachers. And so again, I'm not saying that I'm for or against this one way or the other. It sounds like we're trying to get to the root of our issues, which is retention and filling our vacancies so that we have qualified staff to provide the highest level of education here in Fort Bend ISD, which I'm 100% all for. I just am not convinced that we're solving the problem with adding additional compensation And that how much of the problem is that going to solve? And I do believe you can provide that information. And I'm wondering if maybe that's where we get a survey, which I don't think you have time, but survey from the teachers and ask them, if you're planning on retiring early, what would convince you to stay? Or our young graduates that are seniors in high school, how do we recruit those folks to join our workforce? What would it take? What are they looking for? Can we survey our own students? I guess what I'm asking for is let's get creative on a grow our own approach and rebuilding our staff. And is this really the answer to the problem? Or is there a varied answer that's a combination?
I think I can address that, and that's all those are really good, very good points, and we spend a lot of time in our meetings working on all of that. So, for example, teachers. We did a lot of listening, so they want more time to plan. We built planning days into the calendar, and if you'll look at your calendar this year, you'll see a lot of 3-day weekends and times where we're going to leave them alone and let them do what they're asking. We also created alternative appraisal. We're listening to the things that they want, like you call it the other things, right? But what I think we need to understand in 2023 after COVID, teachers always had a calling, and you could survey them and survey them. I've seen it my whole career. And money was never the top motivator. But what has happened, and the governor has had a teacher force that he's created, and in all of that, number one is compensation. And what is it? Raise Your Hand Texas did a teacher poll. Number one was compensation. So we're seeing that. I think they worked so hard, perhaps during COVID, that they feel like they're worth more for what they're doing. And so it's been a shift, because I would agree with you in the past, but we do see the shift. What we're hearing now too is, I love Fort Bend, I don't want to leave, but if they don't do something, I'm going to have to. And that's the kind of feedback we're getting from the principals, and actually some of it directly to us.
The one component that I would add to this is that there have been a couple of large retailers that have changed their compensation philosophy over the last several years, where we compete with talent. And that's going to be like our classroom aides as well as bus drivers in that regard. Target, Walmart have all announced $15 an hour for starting pay. The same thing with Amazon. And so when that happened, you saw an immediate increase across the spectrum of a drain of talent from those areas. And so something to keep in mind is, I think that you're absolutely right. In some respects, particularly as it relates to peace officers, the pull may not be there, and we can put all the money in the world to it, and we wouldn't necessarily attract more candidates. But in other respects, particularly on those where a degree may not be required, the compensation in that sector has become much more fierce than it's been in the past. And so that's something to keep in mind as well, is that we can grow our own, but when you're making an hourly wage, if someone else is offering 50 cents more an hour down the road, it's very easy to switch, and they do that. They are not necessarily as invested in their retirement as someone who's a professional, and so those are things that are impacting us that we didn't necessarily see in the past.
I'm gonna send this to you here in a minute, but I'm looking at the final report, the executive summary of the Teacher Vacancy Task Force, and the top 2 themes out of 8, I think, are compensation related. But I'll send that executive summary here. But that's from the statewide thing that the governor commissioned.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I mean, Mr. Gwynn, as you know, after we discussed last time, for me, I'm like, if we're going to do this regarding the teachers, and if this is the answer to it, then I don't want to just get by. I'd rather lead the pack when it comes to those folks that impact the classroom. But I also want to have a full understanding and make sure that we're addressing other areas as well, and not just compensation, because if we're hearing, or if we're doing exit interviews and we're finding out that they're not leaving just because of compensation, and there's other things that are influencing those decision factors, we need to make sure we address those as well. And I know safety and security is one of those factors, and feeling supported, and, it goes on and on and on. The other thing, and this is just taking that I didn't see here, and again, we already discussed this, but you and I offline, but is the tax rate versus the property rolls, and that's included today, but that's okay. Hopefully it'll be included somewhere for the public to see. And then, we did the VATRE last year, and I think it's important for the board to have an understanding of the data, a data dive that I believe you guys already did as well. And that information shared with us on what the voters voted for, the percentiles and all that, to compare along with what these projections are. And then to tell us why it would be different, why the yield is different. Because I didn't catch that anywhere, and I think that that's important to have an understanding and recognize why'd we fail, and why are we going to be successful this time, and what are we doing differently?
Well, I think the first thing that I would start with is last time when we did the VATRE, we did not do the public opinion survey. We went into this, it was our first time doing it, and so the access to information that we have in this cycle is very different. And so really having the opportunity to hone in on the specific message that resonates with voters is one thing that looks different. We saw that very specifically with the bond election. When we did the survey and then we looked at the end election results, they were very tightly correlated. I think there was a 2% difference on most of those, how the actual overall election results landed versus what we were told by the consultants. And so that's information that we didn't have previously, that I don't know that we would be able to go back and specifically answer to what message did you use that didn't resonate, because we didn't do any type of surveying that would allow us to determine that.
The other big difference, of course, is the access of having Rana and her firm as a consultant. I mean, we didn't have that for the TRE last time, and she was able to help us focus our message and had a massive impact on it. And in this situation that we're looking at, if the board decides to call it TRE, we would try to bring her under contract again, and she's had 100% success rate with it. And so there would be a lot of work to get the message out. Make no mistake, a lot of work. But we feel like we'd be prepared to be able to do it.
I think I'm shocked that the two finance people didn't say this, but last year on the VATRE, if you recall, we were being compressed at least 5 cents, and what we were asking the community to do was, please don't do that. Instead, we're just asking you to leave it alone. Okay, and then not get that compression. So this time, the state is forcing 18 cents down. So if the board opted to say, okay, but just less 2 or less 3 or whatever the board chose, then that's still quite a decrease for a typical property owner. And that is a very, very different message that people, I think, can get their head around.
No, that's true. The other thing, and Ron is be able to say all kinds of other, strategy things, but the fact is, though, the last election that we had during the TRE, I mean, it was during the midterms. High turnout election, okay, and it's apples and oranges. That kind of election, a midterm election or presidential, versus something like this. When I'm going to send what's on the ballot from the state of Texas. There's 14 propositions or whatever measures or whatever they call them. We know that locally it's mainly going to be about the county bond. The county's going to have a bond on infrastructure and parks. I don't know how that's split between their two propositions. The total is going to be over $800 million. I'm not sure what the tax rate impact is. I haven't seen that. I don't think they have finalized this yet. I think it hasn't been called, but they've been talking about it for more than a year. So we're expecting that to be on the ballot. I think there'll be some commissioners on the ballot. And so other than that, though, one thing that is, I think that one of those election things for the state will be to increase retiree pay for teachers. That's going to impact turnout from educators. So there's a lot of different things out there, but that's where the expertise of Ronna comes in versus what our limited minds are in that political realm.
Thank you, Ms. Malone. So, hey, before we continue, Mr. Bassett, can you clarify to the board, Ms. Ronna, what's her firm's role I know we haven't signed a contract, but I just trying to
we
have a better understanding.
Yeah, we have her proposal, but Advantage is the name of her company, and so we would enter in the same kind of contract that we had with her before the bond election.
I know, but what is the role? What is her role?
Oh, the role.
Yeah. Is it for
she was basically, just use a
messaging and the
football term, she was our
communication.
quarterback. She's the one who helped put everything together, and we followed her lead. She had the plan, and then we followed it. And so she's available to speak now. So
before I just want to clarify, because the last time I recall, we hired the consultant because we didn't have a communication director, right, for the bond. And then that's mainly for that reason, for the communication, for the messaging. I just want to clarify, it's not like a VTRE consultant to control of in charge of everything. I think that's my understanding for the bond. It's not like the bond consultant. It's mainly the role for the communication, the messaging, and actually the work. If I understand correctly, Ms. Malone, I think you probably know more. I think the work is done in-house, but we got the help and the guideline from Ms. Ronna. Can someone clarify that?
Kim, I don't know if you want to speak up but yeah.
Sorry, Ms. Kim, too.
That's all right. I obviously was not here during that bond election, but I can tell you that the way that the process would work this time is that Ronna would be the strategy behind the implementation. We would do the in-house work. She would work with my team and myself on messaging, utilizing the feedback that we got back from the survey, and then we would implement whatever strategies she puts together. Again, like we emphasized, she has a 100% track record with VATRE elections, which are very different than bond elections.
Thank you for that. So it's still basically communication implementation, right? It's like a messaging
I
and all
wouldn't say
that.
the implementation, but the strategy behind
The
it.
strategy for communication, for the messaging.
For the campaign.
For the campaign.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that. Do we have any? Oh, Ms. Hannan.
If there is any way, by the end of the week, staff could get us sort of an at-a-glance document that shows us what we are going to be able to do at 2 cents, 3 cents, 4 cents, 5, kind of not a dissertation, but here's what we can do. And the one thing that is missing in this is, for instance, Q32 talked about special ed, and I see, somebody mentioned that LSSPs are within that professional salary piece, but I'm not seeing a breakdown. Like how much of 2 cents can we take care of with SPED, right? And raises and police officers and if we can only do certain, I'm just, maybe that's too much to ask for, but I would just kind of like to see some differentiation on what are we able to do at 2 cents versus 5 cents. And then the other thing that I want to make sure that I have information on, because Q19 talks about extracurriculars, it's very vague, but it's in the negative, as if there are going to be things removed, right? It also mentions programs of choice. However, Q33 talks about some programs of choice. GT is not a program of choice, but it talks about it as enhancements. So I'm wondering, in those 2, 3, 4, 5 cents, whatever, how much are you thinking for those And so those particular questions with Q32, Q33, Q19, because I'm assuming those questions were asked for specific reasons, I would like to know a little bit more about that as far as budget goes before I have to vote on Monday.
No, I understand that. I think it would be very helpful to administration if the board was able to tell us really how the group felt about the longevity or the differentiated pay. Because if you look at that slide, that's the big rock. That is that's $8.4 million. Okay, it's more than a penny and a half. And so anyway, if that's one of the things that the board is very interested in because of the potential impact it would have on teacher pay and retention and recruiting, then that would narrow things down in terms of what the other potential options are.
Okay.
Okay,
Well,
because that's one of.
for the record, I am very interested in
That
those two strategies that you showed.
Well, there's really just one. There's really just the one in that regard. The other one was if we just did 64,000, and that was just more linear.
and then it goes
without
up.
differentiation, without
No,
more differentiation.
then I'm a proponent of the differentiation. I'm following with Mr. Hamilton's, hey, we're on the same
Now, there's
page with something.
there's one other
It's a
thing
miracle.
there's one other thing that's a little bit new that we haven't even talked about yet, but you received some information on Friday about it, okay? And that's one of the grants that we're looking at to implement one-to-one on a secondary level, okay? There's a lot of issues with regard to, some of the academic benefits of that, just from one of the things that would definitely makes this seem to make more sense. Besides the fact that, the kids are able to have their own machine whenever they're testing, which is a big deal. They also wouldn't be damaging their equipment the way that they usually do. Okay, right now we're paying over $1 million a year in the damage that some of the kids do to the machines that aren't quote unquote theirs. There's ones that they borrow and they put it back into a card. They pop keys or whatever else. Okay, if we were to pursue that grant, we would, we're already planning on buying a lot of computers, through the bond program. But this would have the ability to go one-to-one. It's a $17 million grant. It's fantastic. That would help immensely with us on the bond side for IT. But there's a tail to that. When we would need our own version of the Best Buy Geek Squad, and it costs us about $1.5 million to have those additional techs that we would need to have, and that can't be funded out of bond, or it can't be funded out of this thing. But that $1.5 million would be something that we would use one of these pennies for, and that one's kind of a new thing in comparison to the other things we've been talking about over the past month and a half. So, but that would be one of the things that to very much consider because of the benefits of having that one-to-one, and I do think it would just flat out save us money because of the damage. Because what's interesting is that when you look at the numbers for the kids that we do have the one-to-one, there's very little damage to those machines because those kids have some personal ownership of those, even though it's not theirs, but it is theirs. You know what I mean? So anyway.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bassett. Do we have any questions? You have a question, Ms. Jones?
I was reading the other day for the safety bill, the school safety bill, that the state is allocating $1.4 billion for school safety. And my question is, have you heard how much is Fort Bend ISD receiving?
Yes, ma'am, we have. So the district is estimated to receive about $1.2 million total from that total allocation on an ongoing basis. And so part of the reason that we highlighted for you the format, and based on if we make an adjustment to officer compensation in line with what we discussed, it would be about $4.6 million that it would cost Fort Bend ISD to add an officer to each school. And so we would be running at a deficit. Basically, that's why we're calling it an unfunded mandate, because this district would be picking up an additional $3 million or so to carry those officers over and above what the state has mandated.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Do you have a question? Okay. Dr. Gilliam, I didn't see your hand, so didn't know. Okay.
If you were ready for us. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. And There are just a few things that I want to pull out. First of all, when we're looking at the VATRE and we're looking at RANA, what I get from the very beginning is that it was a win. It was the W. And with the conversation that we had on Saturday, which of course I'm not going to reiterate because there was a lot of the same conversation here, it's a matter of, even looking to see, well, can we do this or can we not do it? We are approaching a VATRE and we want it to pass. I asked the question, I will share this, I asked the question on Saturday, is, okay, so is that, and I asked Christy, Dr. Whitbeck, I'm like, is 2 pennies going to be okay? Or do we need more? And the reason for that was because being on the board since November of 2020, and I'm only talking about me in this situation, and all of the times from November 2020 until today in 2023, we've been talking about money. It's all about money. And then I realized, I thought about the bond, and I was I'm like, we have to get it under, $1 billion. We have to get it, we can't do that $1 billion, we can't do it. And we did. And the reason that we did is when we sat here and we talked about it, and what do we need, and we really looked at what was necessary, and it was hard. But I'm like, okay, we really can do this? And we did. What is it that we really need? So in going now, I'm looking at August of 2023. Are we going to have to address again in 2024 or in 2025 or in 2026? In my brain, it's like, I want the W for the district. Thank you for how this looks on paper. I mean, all I have to do is see that red line at the top, and then I see it keep going up as far as looking at teacher salaries and bus drivers. And of course, I'm for all employees getting a raise. I'm for everyone that is on that sheet. And the reason for it, number one, I'm going to ask before I just assume, is this what you recommend, Dr. Whitbeck?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer under these circumstances. So what I would say to you is we have gone through a tremendous amount of time and energy to dissect numbers, to provide it for the board so that if you're going to give another $1 to a bus driver, that's going to cost $500,000. These kinds of things. What I will say to you as your superintendent is I am very, very concerned should we do nothing. And I've told that to individual board members that have asked me that question. I've said I'm very concerned to do nothing because I do believe we have amazing people out there that are kind of waiting and have been patient. And honestly, our turnover rate this year for teachers wasn't really as high as I was worried it would be because of HISD and what they're offering that's so right next door to us and so extremely high. And so I would just say we can make it work for whatever the board wants to prioritize. If the board is comfortable with even 3 cents or 4 cents, we can play around with that. But what we need to know from you is what is your priorities and how much, if anything, are you willing to go? And then we can help bring you some different scenarios, almost like a jigsaw puzzle that the board can play with so that you're comfortable with every single thing there. But page 22 is, to me, your starting point because that is what 2 pennies will do. And it will cover what you just said. It will cover police officers. It gives the bus drivers $1, all the things that have already been reviewed. It does give you that. It just doesn't go as deep as a lot of things we've talked about, if that helps.
It does help. And so there are 2 things that I wrote down and then I'll be through. And the recommendation, what I heard Matthew say is we still have lots of work to do. And then I also heard him say 2 cents or 5 cents, it's just as challenging. It's just as challenging. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Gilliam. So I think, thanks, Dr. Wayback, to clarify for the page 22. So you answered my question, actually. So this $25 million, just to follow up with Dr. Gilliam, does it include everyone? It's just different race, different number, right? Different steps, whatever we call it. But it does include everyone.
Yes, ma'am, that is correct. The one thing that I would point out that we're going to call it the supercharged differentiated teacher pay scale is not included in this number. We would have to go beyond 2 cents in order to do that.
Understood.
But as we walked through it with you last week, it includes those adjustments, and again, those are included here for you to see. But yes, ma'am, it includes everyone.
Thank you for that. So another thing is, I have 4 minutes literally, so I'll keep it going. So the next one is for the teacher steps, like longevity, right? So I wanted to know, I understand we all wanted to pay teacher more, but my question to you is, can we build it up in our budget? Because we already have the steps in our budget based on my understanding, right? We approve. But this is more than that. It's on top of that. Is that correct?
Yes, that is on top of that. And so the question is, could we build up to that? And I'm the chief financial officer, and I'm the one who gets to deliver the news to departments that we need to make reductions. Mm-hmm. And I'll say that my department is relatively small, and we felt those reductions. And so if I were to go to the chief operating officer, the police chief, the chief information officer, the chief, anyone sitting at this table, and say to them, I need you to make we as a group need to make an additional $8.8 million in reductions to afford additional compensation for teachers. There's no one sitting at this table that would say that's not a good idea. But what they would say is that here's what I'm going to have to cut that could potentially impact students. And so I'll start with the chief operating officer. One of the things that he could do would be to change the distance on the bus routes in order to get us there. That means more students would have to walk or ride. And so those are the types of things that would have to happen in order for us to get that. The organization just went through $23 million in reductions in addition to $16 million the prior year. We have squeezed the rock and as tight as we can, and without going into things that begin to impact programs of choice, students directly, there is not an avenue that I see from my vantage point that would allow us to get to $8.8 million to implement something like this.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. So based on our conversation or email exchange, I wanted to bring this to this board attention. So pre-COVID, even pre-COVID, the district, because how we run the operation, we are, in a way, we are constantly on the edge of deficit. Is that correct statement?
So I think there's two important, the short answer to your question is yes. Has in the past the district adopted a budget where expenditures exceeded revenues? The answer is yes. Have we always maintained our 90-day fund balance reserve? The answer to that question is also yes. However, we were able to do that through a combination of factors. There were a number of times the district received one-time windfalls. So if we go back to when Hurricane Ike happened, the district received about $21 million in property tax, essentially saying this value you lost, you're going to get that back. That allowed us to maintain a 90-day fund balance throughout COVID when we saw a reduction in our students. We received COVID relief funds that helped us maintain our 90-day fund balance. And so through a combination of one-time monies and making expenditure reductions like we have managed to keep the budget at 90 days, but simultaneously spend more than what we're actually bringing in.
Yes, okay, thank you. So the reason I'm asking is back to my previous meetings comment. I struggle with, first of all, I wanted to make my position clear. I do believe we need some extra income. Don't get me wrong. But at the same time, though, I always wanted to know if that's how we operate pre-COVID. I struggle because we have to look at our spending habit. Just put that way. So that being said, okay, so and the last comment I want to make is I know between 2 cents and 5 cents, if you only look at the number is 61.57. But what concerns me is the 32 versus 29. Like for the 5 cents, we have a 32% people strongly will for it, but then we have 29% will strongly against it. To me, this number awfully close. So for me, if we go for the ATRE, I really wanted to like win it. Because it's really, I mean, but the thing is, what at what number though? So how much we want to risk this? So if I feel today, I can be wrong. If we go for 2, based on this page 22, I really feel we can pass this. I really feel I can get behind it. I can support it. I can because this. To me, it's very convincing to the voter. I can go to anyone and tell them why we need this money. But once we go to 5 cents, I'm not as confident as I'm to this one. So either 2 and 3, I'm not so sure. Just like Ms. Hannah asking, can we have something like that? So that being said, it's 6:31. Do we have any other questions?
I would just want to, and I know we're at
Mr.
time,
Garcia.
and we can get, we don't have to get this now, but what are the consultant, I don't know if she's recommending one way or the other, if she thinks she could pass a 5 cent, or if she thinks it'll be, obviously be a little bit more difficult, but, what Ms. Johnson recommends and not necessarily we can do that now, but provide that for us.
Ms. Garcia, I also wanted to point out, I made this statement on Saturday too. Sometimes it's not about if we can or what's the chances we can pass, but I also wanted to remind on this board, we also are responsible to our taxpayers, to the community. So I just want to leave there. Okay, Dr. Gilliam.
I believe we all know that we are responsible, and I think I don't know what Mr. Garcia is thinking. I would like to see that. I would like to see that presented to the entire board, meaning the 5%, the 5 cents.
It's what exactly? It's already presented.
No, the conversation, my apologies, the conversation, and I don't know, well, we're out of time now because Ronna wasn't able to share, but I think that when she shares, she says things that we don't say. So what I'm saying is that if Mr. Garcia wants to have that conversation, I don't know, did I get that? I would like to hear it again.
Well, I didn't. Well, I see her on the screen, but I didn't know if she was going to present or if she was going to say, yes, I think it's, because she's got a 100% success rate. Does she have a 100% success rate in this situation where we're going down, but we're not going down all the way? Can we get 5 cents or is it, obviously it's better if it's 2 cents, but, like I said, I wasn't sure if she had something.
I think it's just understanding her perspective, and I'll stop.
I think,
Ms.
Ms.
Malone.
Day, I know we're out of time, and so in the interest of time, I'm just going to state this. My hunch is, I know I have a whole laundry list of questions running through my head. So usually if you have them all running in your head, so do other people. So I'm thinking we probably all have lots of questions, and I think regarding the puzzle or jigsaw, as Dr. Whitbeck mentioned, and Mr. Gwen, you have the 1 cent, 2 cent. If you have a spreadsheet or a chart where we can plug and play, so we don't have to build it on our own. No, I understand it's here on paper. I'm talking about if
And
you
the
can
spreadsheet.
email me the spreadsheet where it's already built and I can play with it instead of having to create it. For the interest of time, if you already have that, my hunch is everybody on the board could play around and kind of get more of an idea of how every penny would react. And I think the importance of that is not just the 2 cents, but then being able to see the 3, the 4, the 5, and what that really means so we can try to get on the same page.
Thank you, Ms. Malone. I think hers and Ms. Hannon's and
I'll say
very
we
similar.
don't have that, but that is something we can put together relatively quickly and get to you all so that you can do that type of calculations.
Thank you, Ms. Guan. If there's no other questions or comments, can I have a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
The meeting is adjourned, but if you have questions, you please feel free. I assume if the staff are available to answer some questions, yeah. Thank you.
Yes, we are.